In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my
So you are very welcome to this midsummer episode, number 15, I believe, of the Attic Sessions. And we had a plan. We always have these summer plans to do our recording out in the back garden, and then the rain comes and makes it difficult. So we are back in our lovely attic, but because it is probably the hottest day of the year, we have our windows open. So if you hear a bit of sort of background noise occasionally, traffic or alarms going off, or even magpies, that's because we're trying not to suffocate our guests, who we are delighted are joining us today, Enda, Coyle-Greene and Mark Granier. Delighted to have you in the attic, and thanks for coming along.
Delighted to be here, Nessa.
And both are very established poets. Mark has published 5 volumes, the most recent, which just came out a couple of months ago actually, a new and selected called Ghostlight with Salmon. And Enda has published 2 books, the most recent being Map of the Last, which came out in 2013.
2013, yes.
From Daedalus, and she's currently working towards her 3rd volume of poems. So, Enda, if I can ask you first, how did you get embroiled in this mad poetry world?
How did I get embroiled? I don't ever remember getting embroiled. It was just always there.
Yeah.
I always wrote. I can't remember a time when I didn't, after about the age of 7. And I don't know if many people have a memory of when they first had that Yosser Hughes moment. You know, the light bulb goes off and I can do that.
Yeah.
In school, in primary school,
Yeah.
not very far from here, I hasten to add, when a teacher suddenly praised something I'd written and said, I like the style. I remember that word, style.
Yeah.
Thought, okay, I can do that. But I never thought of it in terms of, I always knew I'd be a writer without ever actually, really until much later on, doing anything about it. I just wrote.
Yeah. And were there lots of books at home?
Yeah, everywhere. I could read before I went to school. My home was more musical than bookish.
Yeah.
But I think the two go together.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I knew how to read before I went to school because my mother must have taught me.
Okay.
But my mother was a piano teacher and a singer. There was a lot of music. We were probably a nightmare family to live next door. You know, music going at all hours of the day and night.
And so the sort of the adult poet, when did she start to appear?
Well, the child poet had a couple of things published in Junior Press. Do you remember Junior Press?
I do remember Junior
I remember
Press.
seeing my name and being, oh my gosh, that's me, you know. And then I went into the teenage years, writing. The adult poet didn't really start to take herself seriously as a poet until I was about 30, I think 31. And my husband just said to me one day, there was a local writing group, they had brought a book out, and he said, you should be in that.
Mm.
You should join.
Mm-hmm.
And I went along, as I always said to people, I went along thinking, well, I'm writing all my life, I'm a writer. And then to be met by all these wonderful women, it was an all-women group. Somebody had a play under consideration in the Abbey, somebody had a play under consideration with Radio 4.
This was in Skerries,
In Skerries,
was it?
and I was really intimidated, and I said, I'm never going back again. But I did. And I was with them, for a long time, and I would say exactly 7 years after I joined, more or less, my sister said to me, Enda, you're not Emily Dickinson. You know, writing is not just, standing out is not something mad. My mother was a songwriter.
Yeah.
You know, and I grew up with that, and all the ups and downs and highs and lows and disappointments and good things. I think maybe that made me wary. I didn't want to get embroiled in that. So she said to me, it's not something that Ma did, it's what writers do.
Yeah.
So that's when I started really. I think sending out work makes you tidy it up, type it up properly, and finish with it, sort of.
Okay. So the first book, how soon after you really had that moment did the first book appear?
Oh, a lot later than that. I'm dreadful. I sent out work for years and had work published and was happy when I did and tried not to be devastated when it wasn't, because I think I'd learned a lesson somewhere along the line from growing up in that kind of a house. And I tried to be very level-headed about it, tried, as we all do, or some of us. And then eventually I won the Kavanagh, which was like a total shock. I mean, everybody enters the Kavanagh hoping.
Yeah.
I honestly, truly honestly did not expect to. I remember 2 nights before the call, being out to dinner with my husband and my daughter. It was my birthday, and I remember thinking, I wonder who won the Kavanagh this year, like that.
Yeah.
And I nearly had to be revived. I got the phone call in work. I'm not exaggerating. It was quite a shocking sight to behold.
So the Kavanagh is a prize for a collection.
For a first collection,
Yeah.
by a poet who hasn't published a first collection.
Yeah.
And after that, I was approached, and then the book came out. I think almost a year to the day after the Kavanagh.
And that was Snow Negatives.
Snow Negatives in 2007. So I'm not going to do the maths here and let everyone know exactly how old I am. But it was quite a while after I started publishing.
Very good. And Mark, can I ask you, what was your trigger moment in terms of writing poetry? When did you start, and how were you getting encouragement, and how did that happen?
There were probably a number of them. I first started writing, they weren't really poems, they were just little ditties, I suppose, when I was in Ring College, when I was there for a year in the 70s. I was very lonely because I was an only child. It was the first time I'd been to boarding school. And in order to kind of, I suppose, keep myself company, I wrote these. I discovered I could rhyme very easily, and I had a sense of rhythm or meter. And so I wrote these little books. I stitched them together and sent them back to my mother. It wasn't poetry. It was a way, I suppose, it was a way of amusing myself. Like making little daisy chains out of words, really. And then it kind of got forgotten about, I think. Although I remember in school when I came back to St. Conleth's then for another year or two, and I think I did begin to have an interest in. I remember loving D.H. Lawrence's Snake poem, which I can still remember bits of.
Fabulous.
And I think it was, funnily enough, it was Thomas Kinsella's poem. That was one of those watershed moments that I remember from school.
Which Another September, or the
No,
Mirror of February?
none of the well-known. It was a
Soundings
short
poems.
series called Moralities, and there was one little poem in there about the snail uncurling on a bright lawn and washing on the line, and very Derek Mann images, actually. Those bright kind of eidetic sort of images that stay in the mind. And I suddenly realised that, poetry could be about this, just ordinary domestic, occurrences. And I was really, really taken by it. So I remember they used to ask you to read out whatever poem we were looking at. And I was determined to read this as it should be read. And I put my hands over my ears because I was at the back of the class with the other dossers, and they were prodding me and trying to get me to giggle, but I was determined to read it properly. That's the first time I remember being conscious of how a poem should be read, and that was in school. And then later there were friends of mine, Johnny Hughes, John O'Gorman, Dominic Malumbi. They started this magazine. I think they'd gone into UCD at that stage, or no, it must have been last year's at school, or the early. No, it was first. It must have been in UCD. They started this magazine called Neve, which was quite ambitious in those days because it meant that you had to type everything, then you had to photocopy it, then you had to staple it. And they said, we hear you write poetry, and it hadn't really occurred to me to write any poetry, so I started writing again. And I think really that's what kicked me back into it.
So the little college magazine.
Yeah. And then, of course, in those days, you had the Blana bookshop at the top of Grafton Street. I mean, I dropped out of school when I was about 16. I took my leaving in Bewley's. Literally in Bewley's. And it was around that time that I began to explore contemporary Irish poets. Pierce Hutchinson was a huge influence.
And was there a reading scene?
I wasn't aware of it. Hold on a sec. I remember seeing Peter Fallon, actually, when he was still a young guy on the scene, a young, cool dude. I think it was when it was Gallery, was probably Tara Telephone. It was before it became Gallery. That was in the Foxrock Folk Club.
Okay.
I always remember that.
Yeah.
But I didn't go to regular readings. It was But the Ablana bookshop was they had this little stand outside the bookshop, and it was like it was what you'd see as you walk into a church. They had this stand. I think it was actually called the altar, and the books were facing out.
I remember it, yes.
So you'd see the covers,
Yeah.
and I remember the early gallery books were illustrated by Michael Caine, I think, the covers, and you had Pierce Hutchinson's Watching the Morning Grow, and I remember, I can still see the covers, and those books made a big impression on me. That's when I began to realise that, you know, poetry could be conversational, you know. It didn't have to have that highfalutin sort of Vatic voice. You
That's
know?
a big moment when
Yeah.
you realise that.
It is a big moment.
That it's written
big
by
moment.
And of
living
course-
people.
By living people.
Yeah,
Who
and of
are,
course-
you know, you can actually see
Yeah.
in rooms and then pick up a book
I would
with
have thought, like poets, I would have had maybe a similar experience to you with school, and I thought poets were usually dead.
Male and dead.
Male and dead.
Yeah.
And but I spent my lunch times in the Ablana bookshop, places like that, haunted them. Without thinking, there's something really strange about you because nobody else you know does this. So then when you join a writing group, you start to meet other writers and you realise you're not very strange, you're just part of this community. And you mentioned Peter Fallon, because I did. A moment for me would have been one of the first things I ever submitted or applied for was a workshop he did in the Irish Writers' Centre when he was Writer Fellow in Trinity. And I remember being accepted on that and going along and meeting people. And as you say, that people just like us, ordinary people in a room talking about poetry.
Yeah.
And that was a moment for me. You know, after that I just kept going, you know.
And Bewley's, because you mentioned doing the Leaving Cert in Bewley's.
I wrote a sonnet about it, actually.
Did you?
Yeah, and it won a competition, but then they didn't accept it, I think, because it was kind of like, it was thought to be not, you know, they didn't want a poem about bunking school.
Oh,
Yes,
I see.
indeed.
Oh,
Win
I
the
see.
competition.
So the
it was-
rebel, the
They were
rebel
putting
thing.
out the right image.
That was a while ago.
But
It's
Bewley's
gas.
was also where Poetry Ireland had its introductions in the 90s.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, because you know, my earliest sort of poetry reading memories, I think, were in the upstairs cafe in Bewley's, and hearing people like Tess Gallagher
Yes.
and you know, the people who were coming along through the introductions and sort
The
of having-
Winding Stair.
Yeah, the Winding
And
Stair.
do you
I did
remember
it in the Winding Stair.
The
yeah,
Foggy
did
Jew.
Yeah.
They had the best reading I ever saw on the Foggy Jew, by the way, was this. John McNamee was reading, and he was going on for a long time.
John McNamee of
yeah.
the
Yeah.
the
Oh,
lunchtime.
yes,
Pearl
yes.
Jones dead now,
That's-
and he
didn't
was
know
great
that.
fun. But he was reading for a long time, and then somebody told him to sit down, shut up, this other drunk guy, and he got up and he read a beer mat. He read the back of a beer mat, and he said he read about copper vats, and he put this great sort of orotund sort of voice into it. And we were riveted, and everybody was just in stitches. It was fantastic. It was one of the best readings I've ever seen. Sometimes it's the odd readings that work best. Or another time, I remember Ronan Skean, is it? Or Sheehan?
Ronan Sheehan,
Interrupted, a salmon reading. And he got up and he read this poem by Catullus in the original Latin.
As you do.
And it was
As you do,
fantastic.
yeah.
It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Or Brodsky reading in Russian.
Yeah.
Those were some of the best readings I've seen.
I
where
think
couldn't understand a single word.
there were wackier, more anarchic people on
Definitely,
the poetry scene
definitely.
in the 90s.
I remember leaving a reading in Bowes one night. I had to get a lift home, and my husband arrived to pick me up, and the next day getting a phone call from somebody saying, "Oh, you missed it. You'd only left," and this melee broke out. So it definitely was wackier back in the day.
Yeah.
Remember Mick Mulcahy? Or do you?
The name is familiar.
Maybe he's before your time. He's
We'll pretend he was.
this wildly eccentric character. He used to go around and, basically, I suppose it was kind of like a one-man busking, street performing.
Oh yes, I do know.
But he'd just do these wild acts, you know. He's still around. I met him recently in Listowel, a few years ago.
Okay. And of course then the wonderful Christopher Daybell, who you may remember
Yes.
from
Right.
Grafton
Used to
Street,
sell-
selling his poetry up and down.
Outside
That's right.
And
Bewley's,
think, do you
yeah.
like
Yeah,
poetry?
yeah, yeah.
And
That's what he used to say.
Yeah.
I always had a slight problem with that because he started by saying, "Do you like poetry?" Which implied that if you didn't buy one of his books, you didn't
That's
You
like
didn't like
poetry.
poetry, yes.
I had a slight problem with that, but I remember Christopher. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was very.
It's a very broad question.
Very
Do you
polite.
like poetry?
Yes, indeed. Now, both of you did masters in creative writing.
Yeah.
You did it in Queen's and you did it in Lancaster. Did it, do you think, have a kind of a seismic shift in terms
Not
of how
for
you
me.
wrote?
No, not really.
Not for me.
Yeah, for me.
I'd already published, I mean, it was 95, 96 when I did it. And I published my first poem in New Irish Writing in 1982. So at that stage I'd published quite a bit, and I had a manuscript which had already been rejected, but I was working on it. So it wasn't a huge. It was a way of gathering my thoughts. It also
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
I enjoyed meeting other writers.
Yeah.
I worked with fabulous poets, Maeve McGuckian and Kieran Carson,
Yeah.
Michael Longley, Sinead Morrissey, Leontia Flynn.
Well, that's great.
This was like
Yeah.
being in a sweet shop and
Yeah.
being 5, being in the same room with
Yeah.
these people. But I actually started my masters on the day my first book came off the printer.
Okay.
And Pat Boring gave me the copy of
Yeah.
the book that very evening.
Yeah.
And I'd won the Kavanagh the year before. I'd been writing for years. It was a personal, unfinished business with
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I was working at the time in a company, in a business completely unrelated to literature. I always did that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily out of choice, but it was good for me, I think, looking back on it. And to sit there once a week with people in a room while there's snow falling on an attic window, speaking about The Invisible Iceberg by
Yeah.
Elizabeth Bishop.
Yeah.
I mean, what's not to enjoy that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
no,
loved it.
that's where I first
But you
discovered
don't
James Wright.
do it. You don't do it
Yeah.
to become a writer. And
Yeah.
if you do,
Yeah.
you're going about it the wrong
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
I think.
It's all
Yeah.
the new influences that other people introduce you to.
Yeah,
Yes,
Janice, I think it was, introduced me to James Wright, the American poet. I ended up doing my MA on him.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is Janice Fitzpatrick Simmons,
yeah.
who
Yeah.
with Jimmy
Yeah.
Simmons ran Poets House, who Lancaster offered degrees through. So
That's
that was
right.
your
Yeah. And it was great fun, and it was interesting to I commuted from Dublin,
Yeah.
so I'd go up by the Belfast train, and then I'd get picked up in I think it was called
Whitehead, was it?
Whitehead,
Yeah.
yes.
great off license in Whitehead.
Is there? I didn't
There
know the
was
off license.
there
I
was
knew
in the
the
mid
pub.
'90s.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But I always felt that I had a large sign on me saying, you know, I kick with the other foot.
yes,
But it was just paranoia. I just wasn't used to it. My
Yeah.
parents came from the north, as did my mother actually.
Yeah.
But
I
I-
loved going to the north. It was like
I
going
loved
to
it as well. Yeah,
I think it was
I
between the
enjoyed
two. It was between that time. Then would have been between the two ceasefires.
Yeah.
Because I was at this seminar in Poets House in July '95. So the first ceasefire was happening. And it was a very unionist area, but people would see the Dublin registration and come over and say, really glad you're here,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
shake your hand and stuff.
Yeah.
But then that broke down, and in '96 there was the whole clampdown. The loyalists had a strike. They closed the airport. So and then it was '97 that they had the Good Friday Agreement. So there were kind of pockets of things were opening up, and then they were being closed down again,
Sure.
and then opening up. So depending on what time you hit that,
it was very peaceful out in Island McGee. You
Yeah.
didn't really see much of that.
Yeah.
It was odd that it was at Lancaster University MA, but it was run from the Poets House,
Right.
and that was an unusual, a great little place. You know, just out in the end of nowhere, really.
Yeah.
You know, because
Yeah.
you could actually see the
Scotland.
Scottish coast
Yeah,
from
Isle of Graig.
the house.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
um,
And because Janice was an American, I think she had access to a whole range of American poets
That's
who
right,
were friends of hers who could come and
Yes.
talk, and
That's right.
So it was quite a unique education. I
yeah, it
think,
was the first
for-
time I saw him in Granier.
Yeah.
Was in Island McGee, and he's a fantastic reader, great sense of rhythm.
So you both came back from with your masters,
Yeah.
not particularly feeling like life was going to be very different now, because that was just
No, as I said, it was a personal thing for me,
Yeah.
very much a personal thing, and I didn't feel I have achieved, I am set now for a glittering career or anything,
Yeah.
if I don't think like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
probably I should have at some stage, but I've never done it. So,
But did the poems that you were writing for that feed into the second?
oh gosh, yes, with me they did, because a lot of the work I would have done while I was doing the masters towards my dissertation
Yeah.
was the skeleton of my second collection, not
Yeah.
the last,
Yeah.
which after I graduated, which I sat on for 2 or 3 years while I went through it again.
Yeah.
Because I work slowly, and having to write that quickly you know the way
Yeah.
when you're doing a master's,
Sure.
you're writing
Yeah.
all the time.
Sure.
You're producing, and it was a kind of a different way of working for
Yeah.
me. So
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that what was in the book was me,
Yeah.
and wasn't something that was forced out of
Done
me because
for
I was doing it.
assessment.
Yes, and there
Yeah.
wasn't something that was done for assessment or something done to please a teacher
Yeah.
or to
Yeah.
pass an exam. I wanted
Or
to make
reflect
sure
on course learning. as
absolutely. I wanted to make sure
find
it was
myself
me, and
saying
it was
a lot.
as much me as Snow Negatives
Yeah.
was. I wanted that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was hoping there was some progression of some sort, as you
Yeah.
do, but with every book. But
Do you think they're different books,
books-
style-wise?
not radically, but I think you try and move yourself on, don't you, Mark? When you in some small way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose one does.
And you've
it-
just done your new and selected, and one of the things I wanted to ask you was whether that process of putting, so it's 4 books, 4 previous books into this new and selected, that must have given you a good opportunity to look at the whole kind of body of work and see how
yeah,
you'd shifted.
I think it's it was an opportunity because the way I write is I tend to accumulate poems. I think probably much in the way that people like Larkin or Kavanagh wrote. I don't really have a kind of a project. You know, I don't work that way.
I'd be similar.
I
yeah.
tend to write from moment to moment.
Yeah.
And if something, you know, pulls me in a different direction, I'll just go with it. There was one poet who said, I can't remember his name, at a reading, that, you know, you have an idea or a phrase or a line comes into your head, mostly a phrase or a line. It's mostly words rather than ideas, and you kind of follow it to see where it leads. And really, that's how, for me, a poem develops. So, and that's largely the way books develop. So I don't have these kind of projects. I don't have this idea for a book that is kind of like a solid whole entity.
So did that make a new and selected even tougher to do?
In a
because-
way, no, but because of the way I write,
Yeah.
it gave me an opportunity to put things in a certain shape. I think Haunt, the previous
Yeah.
book before that, is probably the most shapely book that I've put together. The themes have knitted together. They found themselves, really. And Ghostlight, which is a similar title, obviously, it takes those themes, and I think I've been able to find a book with a certain shape to it. The previous collections might not have had such definite shapes, you know.
I find that when I'm writing poem, I would be like you, and I would think about what I'm working on while I'm in it. While I'm in it, it's like, I think Eleni Quillinon described it as like a world entire. You're in this world, and it's walking around in a forest of words. But then when you get to the end, you have a poem, and I would do like you, I would hoard them. But I think unconsciously sometimes they put themselves into an order in your head somewhere.
Sure,
You
yeah.
wouldn't necessarily be writing around a theme. I mean, in the middle of my last book, I have a themed section. But that was something I really wanted to do. It was a local event. I wanted to record it in some way. But you know, when you must have seen it when you were putting your book together, when you say, no, that poem just does not sit with any
Oh
of
yeah,
these.
of course. Of
This
course.
is like an alien feral
Yeah.
baby that
Yeah.
will have to stay out there until the next
No,
book.
I ended
right?
up. I was removing and inserting poems right up and
Yes,
to the wire,
yeah.
and in fact, Peter Sir introduced it, and he made a joke out of it because he said, "I'm going to read a poem that isn't in the book," because it was
It had been
when I
to
got
the very
when
last
I got
minute.
the manuscript.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I took it out, and Peter acknowledged that that's what happens.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
tend to reshape things constantly.
And like, there's
you
nothing
know.
wrong with that poem,
No.
but you just didn't feel it belonged there.
Yeah, I just
That's the way I would be as
I just
well.
felt it wasn't quite strong enough. But there you go. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know. I may have made mistakes. Probably nothing is perfect. You know, absolutely nothing.
Well, might I ask you to
yeah.
maybe read a little selection from it, just to give the viewers
Sure,
a
okay.
sense of... Throw that at you now, having done that. But we're talking about Ghost Lights, so...
Okay.
you know.
Why not?
Well, this is a new and selected. So I'll read. Do you want me to read a
Read-
few poems? Yeah.
Read what you like. love.
Okay. Well, they're fairly short, so I'll read about 3 or 4, if that's okay.
I did like your cat and dog one, can I just say that?
Oh, did you like that?
I did.
Notes on cats and dogs.
Yeah.
That's because I was saying to Enda, we just recently got a dog in the family, a mad little Jack Russell. So it did make me think about cats and dogs. Anyway, the
Well, I
first
would
one.
like to hear that too then.
Would you like to?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well then.
You'll have to find
All
it.
You'll
right,
have to
I'll
find
have to
it.
find it
Yes.
now. Okay, well that's in the new poem. Oh no, it's in the it's in Haunt. No, sorry, what am I saying? It's in the new poems. I can't even tell where it's 120, yeah. Okay, I'll start with that. So I suppose it's a kind of a prose poem, since it's merely a selection of statements on cats and dogs.
Okay.
Notes on cats and dogs. Tree equals wall. Tree equals staircase. The tale is ever hopeful, metronome, propeller of delight. The tale is a seismograph, warning, whip crack of furious silence. No matter how small, a dog has bulk and is earthed. No matter how large, a cat treads 1 millimetre above the ground. A dog is proof against intruders, wind in the chimney, ghosts. A cat is partly an interloper, partly its own ghost. A dog abandons itself to the chase. If it runs fast enough, it will spout wings. A cat's wings are folded into the crouch, the stalk, the pounce. A cat delicately sniffs the air, a leaf, a grass blade. A dog delicately sniffs the air, a leaf, a grass blade, before being yanked, snorting, to the centre of the earth. A dog on its back equals the ultimate submission. A cat on its back equals maybe. Prufrock's predicament. He is a dog. She isn't. In the wake of the dog, opportunistic campfires, tossed bones, tradings of scent, the slow, painstaking deciphering of the human face. In the wake of the cat, settlements, palaces, a niche for a household god. A dog fills a space. A cat opens one.
See, that's so brilliantly observed. So brilliantly observed. And I'm convinced you are a cat person, really.
Oh, you are.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think I've become both a cat and a dog person and now because
you play both sides.
No, I know.
Sometimes
I'm a traitor to cats. But no, I love cats, and we've always had cats. You know, our family had cats for about 30 years. We've had cats, including a lovely old cat that must have lived to 22 or 23.
Yes, they can live to that
photographs of myself as a kid with her.
Yeah.
And then later on, she moved into a Voca Terrace and lived with me and my mother there. So, cats can live for ages.
Well, I cheekily asked for that, thus disrupting your plan as
Not
to what
at
you were
all,
going to
it
read.
doesn't
So,
matter.
do you want to maybe read one?
Yeah, okay. I'll read From Black Rock is a little sonnet I wrote about my father. I never met my father, and my father doesn't know I exist, which is strange. But he's always, I suppose, his absence has been a kind of presence in its own right. And this is called From Black Rock. Here's to you, ghost, father alive or dead. Your surname's reserved seat, your vast library of the unsaid. To your one image, slip of the past, in blurred grey and white, a soldier sitting with my mother, your smile sleepy, hers bright as the ghost light blowing your cover. To the curse or gift you bestow, abstraction, my soft spot for absences, cloud watcher, sea watcher, open to the slow shift of light, the waves always present tenses. To the given, darkening, Dublin Bay almost black, except nearby, where a wave splits a rock.
Lovely.
Read
one more, maybe?
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll read a poem I wrote, which was inspired by I'm fascinated by the prehistoric in many ways, but I couldn't believe this picture I saw of a flute, apparently the oldest musical instrument, and it was made from a vulture, a vulture's bone, apparently 38,000 BC.
Wow.
So this is, I think, so far the oldest instrument discovered. So it's called Vulture Bone Flute. Fitting to see the oldest airs salvaged from a raptor, the air of its wing, and there is music in our bodies, drums and strings, wind instruments fulfilling themselves, so blood and sweat sings to surfaces, half blinding those eyes, lost in the swing of a scythe, a notched sword, the haulage of hominid arms through foliage, music that runs like sap back to the root of our species, jogging on the spot, wired to an iPhone, chants, field hollers, deafening wars, silences, the body bearing the mind away with riffs, keys, tones, variations on what's in us and what will come to blow through our bones.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Wonderful stuff.
Wonderful.
And you're working towards collection number 3. Is it like the tough third album? How's it?
It's completely different. It's the first album or the first book, you're all your life writing it. I mean, in my first book, Snow Negatives, there are poems that I know I wrote when I was in my very early 30s. Now, they weren't published in book format and a lot, but they're essentially those poems.
Mm-hmm.
The second book, as I said, came out of my master's, the skeleton of it did, and I went on to put flesh on the skeleton and make it bigger and more me, I think. The third book has come from a completely different place. I'm not working anymore. I don't have a job. I was one of the casualties of the recession.
Yeah.
And I was fine. I spent my whole life going, oh, I had all day to write. And suddenly I had all day to write. And so therefore the writing is different. It's a completely different process.
Mm-hmm.
So the third book has been more of a gradual feeling, oh, you actually might have a book here, than oh, I'm nearly done with this. So yes, it's been a very different process. And in a way it's been not so much difficult as strange. It's a new experience, having all this time to look at what I've got.
So are you finding subject matter comes more from something you read, or, you know, how has it shifted from the experiences that, you know, maybe found their way into the first book?
I don't know. I've never really given that any thought. I think poems arrive when they're meant to arrive, and there is no logic to how they come. And it's impossible, and we all know, to write about something.
Yeah.
If you've ever been commissioned to write something, as I have, it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult. So perhaps when it's all together, when it's finished and I look at it, I'll say, oh yes, this is I would never have approached that subject when I was on the second book or on the first book. I don't know. I think it's too early for me to really answer that yet.
Can I ask just one thing that occurred to me when you were mentioning about the young women's poems of that first book? Because again, I was resonating with you know, poems in my first collection, which were, you know, we were in our 20s, we were out in the hunt looking for men and that sort of thing. And even though I'm glad I wrote them, they'd never be part of my reading repertoire now, because that was just a different person. So is there something about, you know, particularly if you write autobiographically inspired poems, do they have a shelf life, I suppose?
Well, I didn't write so many autobiographical. Now, that's a very interesting question, because I didn't write so many autobiographical poems then. Perhaps now I'm writing more.
Yeah.
I'm looking back and looking at myself.
Yeah.
I tended to do it through a prism of something else.
Yeah.
You know, I know there's one poem in Snow Negatives that I probably wouldn't read now. I mean, I stand by the poem.
Sure.
But as you say, she
It's a
feels
different
like she was definitely a different person.
Yeah.
Well, she probably isn't. I'm probably still in there somewhere, given half a chance. But
do you have that experience, Mark, of sort of like a different person in some of the poems that are no longer relevant?
It depends on how early you want to go. I mean, obviously, if you go back to reading college, they were little ditties, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
But and then the earlier poems, the very early poems that I began to write when I was 16, I wrote one poem, funnily enough, with an Irish title called Canuck, because I just liked the word.
Yeah.
The Irish word for hill. And that was very inspired by Pierce Hutchinson. And I've borrowed a couple of lines. I don't think I still don't think I understand exactly what the poem is about, although I know it's about climbing a hill. But it was one of those mysterious poems where you get that sense of, I don't like to use the word inspiration because it's like the word poet itself. It always seems a bit precious.
I agree.
But you know, I did have this sense of words just coming into my head. A small song of the beast that might love the impossible, delicate gift, whatever that means, came into my head. And I think that was the first true poem I wrote. I can actually locate it when I was about 16, but I didn't write many like that. And a lot of them were just poor shadows of, you know, Leonard Cohen,
He's as good as anyone to be a poor shadow of.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's and I've always preferred his songs to his poems. Actually, it was Paul Muldoon who said regarding songs that very few poems have as much pressure per square inch as songs, but of course songs have music to carry them,
of course,
and that's the difference, you know, because Leonard Cohen works when he has his music.
Yeah.
But as poems, I don't think he's terribly strong or interesting as a poet, although he is interesting. But those were my first influences. I couldn't. None of those really hold up.
Yeah.
But regarding autobiographically, it's interesting. I mean, most of my stuff, I suppose, is autobiographical, and there is a pushback against that, has been for quite a while, especially with the influence of postmodernism.
Yeah.
And this
Confession
kind of,
is a bad thing.
Yeah, and
I don't go with
the
isms
subversion
at all.
and
Yeah.
you know, language poetry, language poetry, which pushes back against that and seems, you know, and what it perceives to be the tyranny of language itself.
But if you don't write what you
yeah.
are going to, what you need to write, and what you are, and I hate using the term as a poet, it sounds pretentious, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's fake.
Of
You
course.
have to write the poems that are coming out of you.
It's
Yeah.
Whether they're language or isms, whatever ism
Well,
is
I
attached
think
to
most people who write would understand and
Yes.
agree with that,
Yeah, yeah.
even on poem. And there is a divide.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, you know, whatever about fusion. They talk about the fusion of those two streams, if you like, the mainstream, the so-called mainstream, and post-modernism, or whatever you want to call it, post-avant. I still think there's a huge division because they are radically different interests. Autobiographically, you know, I'm still writing. I will still write poems. There's plenty of poems about my mother who died in 2012.
Yes.
I have to write them, you know. I can't, and yet you see people
can't
come up
not
with these
write them,
idiotic
yeah.
statements like,
Yeah.
"Oh, another poem about, you know, a mother or a father. When will the Irish stop writing about their relations?" You know, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Never, actually. You know, in 1,000 years from now, if there are still poets around, if there are still humans,
And if there
in
are
the
still mothers,
Anthropocene, they will be writing
Yeah.
such poems because, you know, what is poetry? And you look up the stars and you think, Jesus, you know, what's that? That's where poetry starts,
Yes,
and that's
indeed.
not going to stop.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely. agree with you.
so I don't understand that huge pushback against what they call, you know, the domestic epiphany.
I ignore all that, Mark, because
Yeah.
I've seen. I'm writing a long time, and I've seen it come. I've seen them come, and I've seen them go. The isms and the ideas, and I just do what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think you're dead right, because what else can you do?
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly. What else can you do?
Well, can you give us an example of what you do?
Right. Well, now speaking of mothers, I'm going to read a mother poem.
Good.
I apologise
No,
to
no.
all the
Don't.
people who object.
Please
No, the
apologise.
reason I'm doing this because I mentioned her earlier, and I felt I was going to read another poem. This is a poem in 3 parts, but I don't.
No,
that's
we'd love to
okay.
hear it. Absolutely,
Okay,
love to
and
hear
it's from the first book. It's from Snow Negatives, and my mother was, as I mentioned, I feel it's only fair to reference her in this poem because what she did as a writer herself was kind of hard for us as children to watch, her ups and downs and her highs and lows. And when they were bad, when things were bad, they kind of destroyed her, which always made me attempt to be very level-headed, as I've already said, about the whole process, and not think I'm curing the world because I can write a poem. But anyway, this was a poem in 3 parts. I wrote about my mother, and I had an experience yesterday where I ran into somebody on the street in Skerries who had a huge connection with my mother. Somebody who lives in Skerries who I had managed to live there for, I won't say a very long time,
Yeah.
and had never met this
Never
person.
met them.
And it suddenly validated my choice to read this. So,
Great.
so that's why I'm reading
Lovely.
it. Okay, at the risk of sounding too spooky. This is words to form my mother. 1. While you were living, I could never breathe life into you to put you on a page. Although, God knows I tried enough to leave your imprint there. My pen became a cage that held you in and only let you go out like a skim of stones on water, grey as air, in air a trace above the flow. I could never face you in that way you faced into each morning, eyes tight around the light that flittered everything you'd ever reached for as your birthright in this world. You eluded me, to sing and teach, to write yourself. Word by word, you slipped away from me. I never heard. 2. I am trying again to write of you, your complexities, your kind simplicity. As usual, no word of it is true, and all the images I watered, grew, I've cut away and do not want to see again, as I am trying to write of you. Your breeding blooded me and led me here through tenements and farmers fled from Germany. I wonder if one word of it is true, or if perhaps you never really knew yourself, but always knew enough of me that I would try again to write of you, from whose hands I long ago withdrew and now can't hold, won't hold the memories. So probably no word of this is true. To die just once is all you have to do, you said, and understood how it would be. I am trying again to write of you. As usual, no word of it is true. 3. Goodbye, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. The last words I spoke to you that night. Not quite closing the door, leaving a gap as small as your voice had become, as small as a child. I looked back, head lowered, eyes already somewhere else. In the chair beside your bed, you tried to rest, your radio silent for once. Your curtains were half drawn against the light that snagged in the branches of the tree outside your window. The sky glazed over, grey, subsumed into the black. The sky glazed over, grey, subsumed into the black that snagged in the branches of the tree outside your window. For once, your curtains were half drawn against the light. In the chair beside your bed, you tried to rest, your radio silent. I looked back, head lowered, eyes already somewhere else. As small as your voice had become, as small as a child, I spoke to you that night, not quite closing the door, leaving a gap. Goodbye, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. The last words.
Oh, well done. Well done.
Thank you.
And you must feel that sort of keeps her alive in a way?
Yes,
A poem like that?
she was a very hard woman to define. It was, I tried, I don't know if you have this experience writing about people you love. Some people are easy to write about. Some people are very easy. My father, I could have rivaled Plath in the amount of daddy poems. I could have, he was a simple, kind man. He was, what you saw was what you got,
Yeah.
you know. My mother was just, she was like Mercury. You couldn't pick her up at all. And the amount, she appears obliquely here and there. She kind of comes into a room in a poem and she slips back out again. And the only way I could tackle her was to put her into a form, because then, you know, you have to stick to the
Yeah,
scheme.
because the 3 parts were, was it sonnet, villanelle?
Sonnet and a mirror poem.
Yeah.
And then there is a
It
term
sounded
for
like a villanelle, yeah?
The middle one was a
middle
villanelle,
one,
yeah. Because that way I couldn't go off on a tangent, because I had to fulfil what I had to fulfil while writing a villanelle, which was good because it meant I kind of corralled her.
Yeah.
So basically the whole thing is about me trying to form her, which was nearly impossible. So
Well, you certainly achieved it.
how did we get on to mothers anyway?
We're
I
always,
don't know.
mothers are...
I might have, well, somebody mentioned autobiographical
Yeah,
writing.
yeah, that was me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I meant to say about I think everybody writes, most poets anyway, write both autobiographically and fictionally.
Yes.
Because, you know, poetry is also fiction.
Of
It's
course
supreme
it is, yes,
fiction,
yes.
as Wallace Stevens, wasn't it, said that?
Yeah. It was
And
Stevens, yeah.
Conor O'Callaghan, I think, published a book of poetry called Fiction.
And those kind of poems are really, really great to get into when you're
Yeah.
working on them, because you are somewhere else
It's
altogether.
play.
Yes,
you know
it's
what I mean?
play,
So
yes.
there's always the play.
Yeah.
There's always that element in writing poetry, and that's what renews it.
Yeah.
You know, and makes it what Pound called, you know, the classic, the perpetually fresh.
Yes.
You know, you have to work with that sense of, there has to be that sense of play, I think, and play with language, and then also there's that dimension of I mean, all the stuff I write is in some way or another autobiographical.
There's always a little piece of yourself in there somewhere, I think. It might only be a word, an image.
But
there.
it changes, you know, and I once wrote a poem called False Memory, because it was about remembering a a visit to a doctor, which when I told my mother about, said,
That
"No, I
didn't
never
happen.
took you to that doctor. I wouldn't take it," because he had a strange sense of humour. And she said, "I wouldn't take you to somebody like that." But I remember it, so
Yes.
Yeah.
it could be a false memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
It could be either of ours false memory. And I like working with that kind of mystery. You know?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
What might have happened, what didn't happen.
You have to give
know?
yourself the room and the freedom
Yeah.
to do that.
And to invent, you know.
People, the problem with poems, with people who don't write poetry, and I worked in an office full of people who didn't write poetry. I know you've done it as well in the past. You know, you are the poet.
Yes.
And everybody thinks you have this fascinating life because your poems could be full of fascinating things, and really your life is as ordinary as anyone else's.
And they also
Is there
think
anybody
that
who
you're
really
wise.
sorry, go on.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say they also think you're wise because you're a poet, and in
Yeah.
fact you don't have
yeah,
a clue
absolutely, yes.
about anything.
Are
Yes,
there
yes.
still people who think that
Oh,
poets have
yes.
fascinating lives?
I think there are, yes.
I mean, it's the opposite of Hemingway, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, you have Paddy Kavanagh's phrase, the standing army of 10,000, which now must be 50 or 60,000.
There's a
at
lot.
least.
There's a lot more of us. And we're going to be on
100,000.
social
Yeah.
welfare, but that's a whole other area of discussion. Can I say thank you so much for coming in and
Oh, it's a
talking to
pleasure.
us?
It was an absolute pleasure,
Longest
Nessa.
day of the year, but you have made it very
And the
short.
hottest day of the year.
And the hottest day
Yeah.
of the year. So I think we are going to go downstairs and get some air and water and recover from
Right.
a lovely chat. So thanks again, Enda. Thanks,
My pleasure.
Martin,
Thanks.
Absolute
Thanks,
for
pleasure.
coming in
It's brilliant.
and reading your lovely work. Thank you for joining us. We will be back again in July. We do have a plan, but I'm not going to tell you about it. That's what I do. So thanks for tuning in, and hope you enjoyed the show.
Yes, I know that I'm just a dreamer. I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.